We're about to read once again, as we do every Rosh Hashanah morning, Akedah Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. Not the sacrifice of Isaac, the binding of Isaac. And you read what people have written about this passage, and it's just enough to just drive you nuts. The story in and of itself is a very upsetting story when one reads what's called the Peshat, the text itself. You read the text itself. There's something very upsetting about the story, that there's a God in heaven who would decide to test. The word you'll hear Ari chant is Nisa. That God decided to Nisa Avraham, to test Avraham. This guy who'd given up all of his past, left the birthplace, the place that he had grown up, was comfortable in, and went to a totally new land to begin a total different way of life, different way of thinking, different value system, a different appreciation of life. Gave up everything. He and his wife and his family went to the land that God would show him to begin a new life that ultimately would become the father of the Jewish people. And then he has to be tested. And how is he tested? He's tested by God saying to him, take your son, your only son, the one you lovest, to the mountain where I will show you. And there you will sacrifice him as a test to me. When we read the Peshat of the story, it is horrifying. And then one asks oneself, it's not an accident that this story is in the Torah. It's there for a reason. It's there for a purpose. There's a message here. And the question becomes, what does the Jewish tradition see that message to be? What does the Jewish tradition see? How does it read the story? What is it teaching us? And then the question becomes, what the heck is a Torah story? What is a chapter of this revered, the most exquisite set of books ever put together? What is it? And is it a newspaper account of events? Have you ever asked yourself, whose voice is the Torah speaking in? When the Torah narrative describes something, who's talking? It can't be God, because when God talks about God's self, God talks about I. There's no I. Who's the voice? Who is telling us the story in the Torah? Is it a reporter who was there? No. Is the story, it's like you can't believe anything you read anyway. No one takes anything they read now in the newspaper as truth. No, or the internet, where you have no idea what's true. The Torah is not a newspaper account of a story. And I'm hoping that this is not the only place people hear this. There is no real God in heaven who ever said to a real father, take your son to a mountain and kill him as a test for me. There's no God that ever did that. Certainly no Jewish God. Certainly no God who ultimately becomes the foundation of the great religious traditions of the world. No Jewish God ever did that. And no father went along with it. By the way, the sad thing is, there are crazy fathers. More than there's a crazy God, there are crazy fathers. And one of the things that was written about the Akedah, which is true, is that if the story were real, Abraham is the worst kind of religious fanatic the world has ever seen. And that God is despicable. By the way, some people will say, if that's the God, well, I don't need that God. Oh, you don't need, well, God's going to be very upset to hear that. I'll never understand somebody saying, well, I don't need that God. What? It's not about needing, if it's God. Are you talking about God? Whether you need God or not has no bearing on anything at all. It says something about you, but nothing about God. I don't need God. There may not be a God. But if there is a God, he doesn't care whether somebody says, I don't need you. He's not going to say, oh, wait a minute. Harry says, he doesn't need me. I better change my ways. God we're talking about. However, there is no God like that anyway. It's never what the Jewish tradition meant by God. There was no God who told Abraham to do this. There was no Abraham who did it. And if that's true, if there was no God who commanded a father to take his son and kill him, and there was no father who did it, what's the story doing in the Torah? And the answer is A, underline the word story. Every religious tradition talks in great mythic images. The myth, the story, the legend is the way great ideas are communicated. And there's an understanding, there's a presumption that people who read the myth, the story, the epic, understand it's not literally true. And every year it has to be said again, it's not true, but there's truth in it. And the question is, what's the truth in it? And by the way, I said this last year, I don't need to repeat this in detail. I remind you, there's a point to this story written not for people living in the 21st century, written for people living hundreds of years BCE, who lived in an age where they thought God required child sacrifice. Your firstborn child was given to God. There was, at the time of early ancient Israel, a common practice of child sacrifice. This story is extraordinarily liberating when it was written. It was written with a different twist. You must be ready to do what everybody is doing, but our God does not require it. In the end, there is no sacrifice. Again, I said this last year. If we were living 500, 600, 700, 8 million, it's really more like 1,000 BCE, and we read a story in which, wait a minute, you mean God doesn't require that I take my child and offer him as a sacrifice? We'd be thrilled. Wouldn't be a bad story. We'd be thrilled. Sarah, guess what I just learned? Isaac is safe. In its time, it's a tremendously advanced, liberating, spectacular story. But we don't live 1,000 BCE or 500 BCE. The Jewish tradition is not from 1,000 BCE. The Jewish tradition was created roughly 200 BCE through 500 CE. This great rabbinic period when the Talmud was created, where Jewish Midrash was created, when all of Jewish law was initially formulated. And at that point, they'd already been far beyond child sacrifice. And the question for our ancestors who created what you and I know as Judaism, not ancient Near Eastern religion, no. Judaism, the Jewish tradition, what we call Torah. When these people created Torah, they already were way beyond child sacrifice. And for them, the story didn't have that import. It didn't have that impact. So for them, what was going on in this story? That this myth becomes codified in the 5 books of Moses. And the answer is, so interesting to see what the Jewish tradition does with the character of Abraham. In the Chavurot, we celebrate Rosh Hashanah on one day. In traditional synagogues, many synagogues celebrate for 2 days. The reading of the Akedah is not done on the first day. The Akedah is read the second day. The first day of Rosh Hashanah all over the Jewish world, in synagogues where there are 2 days, it's a different story. Do you know which story? I will tell you which story. They start this story earlier. In the same Sedra, they started chapters earlier, and they start with a different story. And the story that is started with is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's the story in which, after Abraham is circumcised with his entire family, and he's sitting in his tent, and 3 strangers come. They're actually the 3 angels. And they tell Abraham that he is going to be the father, even in his old age, of the son he always wanted. And then there's this very interesting line where God says, I wonder if I should tell Abraham what I'm about to do. And he decides he's going to do it. He's going to tell Abraham. And he tells Abraham, through the angel, that the cry of the evil of Sodom and Gomorrah has come up to heaven, and he is going to destroy the city, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, these evil cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, worse than Nineveh. And he tells Abraham, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And what follows is this very well-known interchange between Abraham and God, in which Abraham is shocked that God is considering destroying 2 cities of human beings. He's shocked. And he says this magnificent line, will you destroy the innocent with the wicked? Abraham says to God, will you not be just? You're the God of justice. You won't be just? Impossible. And by the way, what if there are 50 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah? Will you spare the city for the sake of those 50 righteous people? And God says, yes. Abraham says, okay. But supposing there are only 45. For 45, will you spare the city? God says, yes. For 45, I'll spare the city. God, Abraham says, you're the most wonderful God in the whole heaven. Of all the pantheon of gods, you're the big God. And what about 35? And what about 30? What about 25? What about 20? What about 10? And when he gets to 10, you can feel the text. God says, okay, 10, I'm out of here. In the end, they can't find 10 righteous people. The cities are destroyed. That's read Rosh Hashanah morning. Day 2, the Akedah is read. The contrast of Abraham in Sodom and Gomorrah and in the Akedah is breathtaking. In the first story, Abraham stands up to God and brings moral judgment against God. And in story 2, Abraham accepts in total silence, does exactly what he's told, and only at the last moment do the angels force God to avert the severe decree, to come to Abraham and say, don't do it. And what do those 2 stories say? Footnote, in reality, the two stories have nothing to do with each other. Each have a separate point. And the point of the Akedah is you don't sacrifice to God. That's the original intent. But that's not how the Jewish tradition reads it. And what's interesting about the Jewish tradition is the Jewish tradition is also terribly upset with the Akedah. They're in love with the Abraham of the Sodom and Gomorrah story. They cannot see the same Abraham in the Akedah. Incidentally, to be absolutely fair, there is a way in which the grand myth of the Akedah expresses the truth of life. There is a truth to the fact that if there is a family committed to a certain kind of justice, that takes a stand against evil, against in some way crushing the weak, taking advantage of those who cannot protect themselves, not being kind, thoughtful, grateful, thankful, being cruel to the stranger, to the widow, to the orphan. If there's a family that wants to stand up for honest, moral justice and peace, very often they'll be putting their children at risk. Not necessarily of life and death, but a certain kind of ostracism. They'll also be asking of their child sometimes to give up things. The amount of time spent on pleasure is different. And there's no Jew who does not understand the vicissitudes of Jewish history and what Jewish life has sometimes done to Jewish children. There is a profound truth symbolically in the Akedah. And I've argued on other Rosh Hashanah mornings that it is one of the kindest stories in the Torah because it is a warning that gives every Jewish family an option to opt out. But there also is this strain in the Midrash that is so upset with the Abraham of the text that they change the whole meaning of the story. And it's the meaning we've talked about so often, where in the end, when Abraham is walking up the mountain together with his son Isaac, who is not a child. Isaac is 37 years old. He's a young adult. He could stop the Akedah any moment he wanted. We've talked about it in other Rosh Hashanahs that in some way he becomes the real hero of the Akedah. They go together, and at one point Isaac says to Abraham, I see the fire, I see the wood, where's the lamb? To which Abraham responds, God will provide the lamb. And you might say, well, that's a father trying to keep a son from becoming anxious. The Midrash says it may be what Abraham believed was going to happen all along. That Abraham's confidence was, this cannot be. And then he gets to the top of the mountain and he's about to do the sacrifice. And then you know the story where God comes and says, don't do it. Actually, he sends an angel. The angel says, Abraham, stop. And Abraham, in the Midrash, says to the angel, if God wants me to stop, you send God, God's self here, and he has to tell me himself. God has to tell me God's self. And in the Midrash, God comes, and God says to Abraham, yes, don't do the sacrifice. And Abraham says to God, now you come to me? And then the great Midrash where Abraham says to God, you broke your promise. You promised I would be a great and mighty nation. My children would be more than the stars in the heavens and the grains of sand on the seashore. And how is this supposed to be affected? And Was it not through Isaac? God says yes. Isaac was supposed to be the way in which the promise you gave me when I left Haran was to be fulfilled through Isaac, and then you tell me to sacrifice him? You broke your promise to me. And God says in the Midrash, God says, yes, I broke my promise. Now, I hope you appreciate in the history of religious traditions how extraordinary a Midrash like that is. Normally, God doesn't say things like, yes, I broke my promise. Most people, if they think there is a God, it's not a God who breaks promises. But the Midrash isn't talking about the real God. The tradition believes there is a God in this universe. But it's not a person. It's not a God who's described in the Torah. It is a mystery, which every now and then we sense only in the most positive way. The Shekhinah every now and then is sensed by human beings as walking at their right hand, validating every moral, wonderful, beautiful, humane thought and deed. In the story, whether it's the text or the Midrash, they write about God as if God were a character in a play, because that's what this is, a great morality play. And what the Midrash creates is a morality play in which Abraham's moral sensibilities remain at the forefront. The difference between the Abraham in Sodom and Gomorrah, and the Abraham in the Midrash of the Akedah is the same Abraham. The text, it's not the same. In the Midrash, Abraham remains the moral conscience for God. Abraham drives the morality of the Midrash as Abraham drove the morality of the Sodom and Gomorrah story. In the Jewish tradition, there was no other possibility. The Jewish tradition requires human beings to be a moral voice in the universe, doing what is the best possible for other human beings. And notice, Abraham does this before the Torah is given at Sinai. And the rabbis ask, how did Abraham know? From whence did this moral sensitivity come that he would argue against God? The God of justice must do justly. You broke your promise. And the Jewish tradition says it's very interesting because fundamentalists don't want to accept this, but it's a Jewish notion. There is inherent in the human soul a moral sensitivity, even before and without Torah. That to be human is to have a sense of what it is to be a kind, gentle, loving person who understands and is committed to right and not wrong. And right changes all the time. The content of right changes. The content of truth changes all the time. But a commitment to truth and to the right, that is enduring. That is divine. And that's inside every human being. That's the Jewish faith. The faith of the Jewish tradition was in Abraham, not in God. The faith of the Jewish tradition is in us. And what we are to learn from the Sodom and Gomorrah story is to stand up and say no to power. Whatever the power is, it must be just, and we have a moral responsibility to speak out when we don't feel it is being just. And then the Akedah, it turns out through the Midrash, it's the same story. It's the same Abraham who ultimately brings God to account and says to God, God, I'm going to forgive you. God says, thank you. On one condition, Abraham says, that every Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when human beings stand in judgment of themselves and of heaven, you will forgive them as I forgive you today. You understand, this never happened, but the rabbis created a story in which the God of the universe promises to be forgiving as we are to be forgiving of ourselves, very important, of ourselves, and more important, of people who may have injured us. The greatness of the Akedah is the greatness of the Jewish tradition. When we read the story, we are to hear a story about an ideal of the Jewish people that always stands for the morality of goodness and kindness and gentleness and respect and reverence for life, even in the face of power, even in the face of heaven itself. And as we read that story, I hope those are the Midrashim and the ideas that go through your mind as this glorious passage is read.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.